But welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for putting in the chat where you're joining us from. My name is Sarah Harlan. I'm the partnerships team lead for the Knowledge Success Project, which is a USAID funded project. And we are really excited to be partnering with FP 2020 on this webinar series. So we'll just get started with some quick introductions and housekeeping while we try to resolve the interpretation issues. This webinar will last for approximately an hour, and we will have a short presentation followed by an open Q&A session. So many of you sent your questions in advance. If you have not already, please enter them in the chat window. And as soon as we are able to resolve our issues with the French translation, we will be also offering simultaneous interpretation, and we will record in both English and French. And we'll make sure that that video and audio recording is available in the coming days. So participants are muted throughout the duration of the session, but if you do have any questions for the speaker, please type them in the chat box and you can follow along. And we'll be collecting these questions for the Q&A period following the presentation. And my Knowledge Success and FP 2020 colleagues will be moderating the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So it looks like the translation interpretation issues have been resolved, and that is happening. So to listen in French, please follow the link that you were sent in the email, and you can click when the audio box comes up, click on the X in the left-hand corner, and then on a separate device, you want to click on French audio only and follow those prompts, and please keep your microphones muted. So thanks to my colleagues for getting that resolved. So now I'm pleased to introduce you to our moderator for today, Kate Lane. Kate is the director of the Adolescent and Youth portfolio at FP 2020. She's worked on adolescent and youth issues for a number of years, and we're pleased to be partnering with her and the FP 2020 team on this webinar series. So I'll hand it over to you, Kate.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this first session of Connecting Conversations. This is going to be a series of conversations on adolescent health and adolescent health focused programs, services and policies hosted by FP 2020 and Knowledge Success. And over the next year, we hope to host a number of conversations every 2 weeks or so on topics that are intended to help you design and implement stronger programs for young people. And we believe that this more conversational style will hopefully keep you coming back for more. The series is going to be divided into 5 modules. This first module that we're starting today is a foundational module of 5 sessions, which is intended to provide some important background and contextual information on adolescent development and health. And subsequent modules will touch on improving young people's knowledge and skills, providing services, creating supportive environments, and finally addressing the diversity of young people. Today we're kicking off the series by exploring the importance and complexity of the second decade of life, so much more than just hormones and puberty. This phase of life really lays the foundation for health across the life course and even for the next generation. So we're very, very pleased to have Professor Susan Sawyer with us to take us through this session, and I promise you will learn a lot. Professor Sawyer is based at the University of Melbourne in Australia, where she holds the chair of adolescent health and is also the director of the Center of Adolescent Health at Royal Children's Hospital, which is a World Health Organization collaborating center. Professor Sawyer was also a commissioner for the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing, and she's currently the president of the International Association for Adolescent Health. We're so pleased that she's agreed to start off, especially as she's a bit of our guinea pig. And given all the different time zones, she's actually speaking to us from her home in Melbourne at 9 o'clock tonight. So, Professor Sawyer, the floor is yours, and I think we're starting with these 2 poll questions. So go ahead and please respond, all of you, please respond to the poll questions, and Professor Sawyer will use the answers to these questions to kick us off into her remarks. Over to you.
Thanks, Kate, and whatever time zone you're in, as we would say in Australia, g'day. Good evening to you from Melbourne, where I am. It's really lovely to have seen where so many of you are from, but let's start. Question 1, in the past 10 years, what proportion of global research was in under 5-year-olds versus 10 to 19-year-olds?
And
then the
second questions. Oh,
those
excuse me,
questions
the
have
poll
disappeared.
questions
Yep.
should be appearing now, Sarah.
Great. Yeah. And then the second question is, what proportion of global developmental assistance goes to adolescents? So I'm going to come back to the answers of these right at the end of my presentation. And I'm now going to start, I hope, screen sharing and let you, are we going to, no, that's, can you stop?
Yes, we see it, Susan.
I don't. Okay. Let me just do that again. I might do this one. Can you see that?
I see your slides now. Yes, that's great.
Yep. Okay. So as Kate mentioned, I was privileged enough in 2016 to be one of the lead commissioners for the Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health, and this 25,000 word report is available open access online on the Lancet website. So for those of you who haven't looked at it, I would certainly commend it to you. And one of the ideas embodied in this report was really a different way of thinking about adolescence, the period of life, rather than previous ways of thinking of adolescence as a period of risk, rather about thinking of the transformative potential of adolescence. And that's really why I've titled this talk the transformative power of adolescence. And transformative are two types of ways of thinking about it. Transformative, firstly, in terms of the individual, in terms of their life course, but transformative for countries, for communities as well, in terms of if we get investments right in young people, then the capabilities that those young people will be transformative for their communities. And this notion of reaping the demographic dividend is something that's really inherently based on this notion of transformation. And I think if we just sit and think about Greta Thunberg, for example, here, and I had to put up this quote here about you don't listen to the science, you're only interested in solutions that will enable you to carry on like before, because obviously in terms of this COVID pandemic, we're really needing to listen to the science very much. But I think we can really appreciate that adolescents have some incredible powers, if you like, to be transformative with other young people as well. And last year I was speaking at a meeting in Trinidad, and I pulled up this slide here thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice, it's winter here in Melbourne, wouldn't it be nice to be on this beach in Trinidad, where the author V.S. Naipaul, who was from Trinidad, I came across this wonderful quote by him, which even though I don't think he was actually speaking about adolescence, for me, this really embodies adolescence. After all, we make ourselves according to the ideas we have of our possibilities. And those ideas we have about ourselves and who we are and what we might do with our lives get absolutely embedded into our skins during adolescence. Now, I don't know about you, but when I went to university, I'm a medical doctor, I'm a pediatrician, and when I went to university, all I learned about adolescence was puberty, and all I learned about in terms of puberty was hormones. And hormones are incredibly important on one hand in terms of pubertal development. They, in a sense, catapult us as individuals from a child's body to an adult body in a remarkably short period of years. And I think we sometimes forget how transformative puberty is in terms of our physical selves. And I've highlighted the pubertal cascade starting here at the ages of sort of 7 to 9, which some of you might be surprised at. But adrenarche, or the activation of the adrenal gland, occurs much before the development of secondary sexual characteristics of estrogen and testosterone. But the pubertal cascade then signals, if you like, an equally profound aspect of human development, and that's brain development, that I've signaled here in red as the earliest aspect of brain development, the subcortical maturation, and then green, the latter part of brain development in terms of the prefrontal cortex. And brain development, if you look at the timing of this, I mean, the human brain is at its adult weight at the age of about 8, but it's this incredibly dynamic process of maturation that occurs from birth all of the way through life. But really, in terms of our adult brain, probably getting to our adult brains at least to the mid to, if not the late 20s. But it doesn't just happen. Just like with children's development and maturation, it occurs in the context of our environments. Just like for adolescence, that where we get to at the end of adolescence in terms of our neurological capabilities depends on the interactions that occur in terms of our nutritional, physical, social, cultural environments. And if those environments are rich and the opportunities are great, then at the end of adolescence, we, in our life course, should see young people being, if you like, at their fittest, smartest, strongest, in terms of having high-level cognitive, social, and emotional capacities. Now, so this means, if you like, that adolescent brain maturation is about intellectual development or cognitive development, but it's about much more than that. It's about emotional regulation and impulse control. It's about the changing notion of social affinity or peer relationships. Decision-making obviously comes from that combination of intellect, emotional regulation, peers, and impulse control. And it also reflects notions of decisions that are made in the cold, hard light of day when one's intellect might be foremost, versus the notion of hot cognitions or decisions that are happening later on. And let's, in the context of a peer environment. So let's just give you a very brief example of that. This is an experiment where people of different ages as individuals were seated behind a simulated driving test on a computer screen and asked to drive as fast and as accurately as they possibly could. And the number of accidents are here on the y-axis. And you can see that no doubt, you know, adults, multiple 10,000 hours of driving experience is balanced by adolescents, multiple hours of hand-eye coordination from computer games. So surprise, surprise, the number of accidents is pretty similar in each group. Now, what do you think happens when the scientists invited each individual to have 4 or 5 of their closest friends stand behind them while they repeated the test, with the instructions being to their friends that they had to be silent? This was not about egging on or encouragement, but this was silently standing behind when the adolescent, young adult, or adult repeated the test. Surprise, surprise, for us as adults, we were able to maintain our concentration on the task at hand. But the younger you were, the far more likely you were to be distracted by your friends around you, even though they were silent. I find this the most powerful example of the notion of hot cognitions. And then if we think in terms of the life course, and if we think about adolescence, and on the x-axis here, and this is a diagram from the Lancet Commission, I call it the sperm diagram, but it's basically just trying to sort of demonstrate that there is no other time within the life course than adolescence, which is so dynamic for so many different changes that are taking place. In terms of the influence of peers and media, if you like, as an uber peer that is up at the top of the diagram, the transitions between education and employment as incredibly important social determinants of health. And then the transitions within one's family in terms of moving from one's family of origin to forming one's own family. And all of this is on the background of the stippled community structural determinants where gender roles and gendered expectations about education and employment, about the structural determinants of health, such as poverty, are equally influential in terms of this sort of process of engagement. When I talk about adolescence being transformative in the individual's life course, this is the diagram that I really think of. And I think of this as the last diagram is the sperm diagram, then I think of this diagram as being a bit like a butterfly. The worm, and I'm just going to bring up my arrow here, is, if you like, this life course starting preconceptually, going into adulthood, and then the next generation going around and around. So we can see that adolescence is just one part of, obviously, the lifespan. But in referring to this as a butterfly, I tend to think of these needs here and these actions below as two arms, or if you like, the two wings of the butterfly. And so the actions that we need to be putting in place should be matched to the needs that are there, that individuals have and that communities have, whether in relationship to health problems, such as diabetes or anemia, whether in terms of health risks, such as overweight or bullying, which is such an important risk for depression and anxiety, or indeed in terms of health determinants. And so we can then think of those actions, therefore, needing to reflect what those particular needs might be. And so when we talked about in the Lancet Commission this notion of the triple dividend, and if you were here in front of me in a lecture, I'd be asking you to put up your hands, how many of you have ever heard of this language of investing in the triple dividend? The notion of that is the threefold benefit that comes from investments in adolescence. So the first investment being, if we get it right, then we will have adolescents who are healthier during the adolescent time. So less deaths from suicide, for example, better emotional well-being, less anemia, better relationships. If we get it right in adolescence, we will also get healthier adults. And tobacco is probably the best example of that in terms of the risk factors for non-communicable disease typically have their onset largely in childhood and adolescence. And so if you don't start smoking as a teenager, you're very unlikely to smoke as an adult, and therefore your health in adulthood will be so much better. And then the third part of the triple dividend is the intergenerational benefits. So that young women, for example, who delay childbirth through to their 20s, who are more educated by having more years of schooling before having children, will indeed themselves have healthier children. So the benefits indeed then being for the next generation as well. In the Lancet Commission, we grouped all of the global burden of disease disorders into 9 different groupings. And then we further grouped them into these 3 broad groupings. I'm not going to go into the details of how we did this because it would take too much time. But just think of these big broad groupings, and then we grouped countries as well according to whether adolescents in each country were predominantly diseases of poverty, injury excess country, or NCD predominant countries. This slide's a little bit complicated, but I'll just take you through it. It basically, there are 2 paired bars about the country. So NCD predominant countries, so these are wealthier countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US, Western Europe, and panels for females and males. And from 1990 through to 2013 for each of these panels. In the middle is the, it's interesting, my arrow is, oh yeah, it is working. In the middle, we can see the injury excess countries. These are largely Latin American countries, the Caribbean, and the ex-Soviet Union countries as well. And then multi-burden countries on the far right are largely in sub-Saharan Africa and also in South Asia, such as India, Bangladesh. What we can see here is the excess, if you like, from those diseases of poverty, as we call them. HIV, in the dark red or maroon, the overwhelming pattern of infectious or communicable diseases, sexual and reproductive health, and this is largely maternal mortality, and then malnutrition, very much led by anemia. And we can see that there is an excess burden on females rather than males. When we turn, however, to injury excess countries, we can see that actually it's males who have an excess in terms of the disability adjusted life years. So this is a combination of both mortality, years of life lived with a disorder, and years of life lost from premature death, so mortality and morbidity. But the big green swathe for all of these countries, with remarkably little change from 1990 through to 2013, are chronic physical disorders in the dark green and mental disorders in the paler green. So when we think back to that butterfly diagram on the previous slide, this notion of matching actions to need is highlighting that in different countries, there are different actions that we really need to be thinking about according to where that excess burden is, and according in time in terms of where we are imagining those future risks are going to be, predicting that change will occur very rapidly. At the same time that we were involved with the Lancet Commission, some of our colleagues in Melbourne were also working with UNFPA on the first investment case for adolescent health. And this paper, also open access in the Lancet, describes the benefit cost ratios from investing in adolescent health interventions. For those of you who are new to this, and I certainly was new to this before this publication, a benefit cost ratio of 1 is considered pretty reasonable. For every dollar you invest, you get $1 return. And I've put a line here as a BCR of 2, which is considered really pretty good. But you can see here the excellent benefit cost ratios for these 4 areas of interventions in adolescent health. And the 2 different colours, the blue is the base case, that, if you like, is the most optimistic, and the red is the most pessimistic. If you increase costs and you reduce the perceived benefit by 20%, you are still getting dramatic benefits, and the greater returns were in the poorer countries rather than the wealthier countries. So there is certainly tremendous value to come from investing in adolescents. Now, when we published the Lancet Commission and we framed adolescents from 10 to 24 years of age, and I really expected that we were going to be shot down in flames by 2 groups of people. One group, largely probably parents, saying, but hang on a tick, 10-year-olds aren't yet adolescents. And then probably I felt we were going to be shot down largely by young people themselves, saying, but hang on a tick, I'm adult, I don't think of myself as an adolescent. And I was fascinated that we hardly got any pushback at all. And I said, if people really understand that what we were really saying is, even though we called it adolescence and young adulthood and then used the shorthand of adolescence, we really did mean that these, if you like, are the developmental years, as I call them, of 0 to 24, with adolescence extending from 10 to 24. And so this paper, which is the one that I think the team from EPIC 2020 has circulated beforehand, really creates, and it's only a relatively short paper, unlike the Lancet Commission, and it's in much more accessible language, really tries to articulate a lot of what I've been talking about over the last little while. The importance of this, and it is important how we define and conceptualize adolescence, matters because it completely influences the scope, the focus, the nature of the laws and policies and programs that are intended to either protect young people or to empower young people. And I typically can't talk about this without doing this sort of yin-yang thing with my diagram with my hands, where for younger children, obviously, the focus is all about caring and protection. Think of a babe in arms. But the older the children become and the older that adolescents become, we are needing to equally be empowering and encouraging their participation, but still needing to provide an element of care and protection. I don't know, I had suggested that there might be a second paper also to circulate, which was specifically on adolescent sexual and reproductive health. I'm thinking about this balance of care and protection versus empowerment and participation that Suzanne Petroni led, because it's saying that there's not a single right age at which this balance occurs, but the riskier the situation, so marriage, if you like, it's a legal contract. It's pretty significant in terms of the repercussions. And so we were arguing that the age of marriage should absolutely be extending up to at least 18 or 19, or ideally even older. But the age of onset for sexual intercourse doesn't have to be the same age for that, as long as we are able to provide young people with an appropriate contraceptive balance that keeps them safe. Obviously, this is challenging, that there is a different focus and a different terminology, historically, perhaps more so than now, within different UN agencies. Increasingly, I think there is growing consensus, at least from the UN community, about 10 to 19-year-olds being referred to as adolescents. But I think I would feel pretty strongly that in 10 years' time, we're absolutely going to be referring to adolescents as 10 to 24-year-olds. I have little doubt about that. But, you know, UNICEF has historically focused much more on younger adolescents, on 10 to 14-year-olds. And obviously UNFPA's focus has been on older young people, if you like. But this confusion of language is problematic and pretty unhelpful, I think, for the field. So, coming to an end, what are our questions? In the past 10 years, what proportion of global research? The right answer is, depending on which website you look at, is actually 95%. So only 15% of you got that one right. And indeed, it's 95% on Google Scholar, but if you look at the search engine PubMed, it was actually 99% of research is in under 5-year-olds. So one of the questions in terms of why do we struggle so much around adolescent programming is that we are relatively in our infancy in terms of really thinking about the breadth of intersectoral programs that we could be thinking about. In terms of the proportion of global developmental assistance that goes to adolescents, the biggest response here was in terms of the 13%. But if we can close that now and go to my next slide. I think we might have stopped sharing. I'm just going to stop sharing that and then screen share again and go, hopefully. Let me, the wonderful technology. Let me try that again. Screen share. Try that one again. Have you got screen share for me? I seem to be stuck. Now, no, I am now going through it. Let me just get to the end. So what proportion of developmental assistance actually goes to adolescents? The reason I put up these other ones was that can we stop sharing the poll, please? So that 30% in countries that are recipients of global developmental assistance, the population of adolescents, and this is of 10 to 19-year-olds, is about 30%. But those 30% constitute about 13% of the disease burden. So arguably, 13% should be the right answer. But actually, when this work was done by researchers led at Harvard, the actual answer was 1.6%. So adolescents are being disproportionately invested in according to either their population or their disease burden. Kate had asked me, could I possibly share this slide with you? So coming to the very end, this is my Ikea slide. I don't know how many of you know the Swedish furniture maker, but you could imagine that if you had a plastic car and tried to put this car together to make it work, I can guarantee that none of us could make this car work. Because why? In Australia, we would say there's no petrol. In America, you'd say there's no gas. And the gas of this car, the petrol of this car, is all about the positive youth development aspects of the investments we make, not in terms of diabetes care or not in terms of mental health care and not simply in terms of promoting access to contraception, as important as all of these aspects are. But these much more foundational aspects of making sure that adolescents are safe physically and emotionally, grow up with a sense of confidence and self-esteem, are academically engaged in a learning agenda and are developing the sort of life skills that equip them later in life. And my last slide, sadly, the World Congress on Adolescent Health that's held only every 3 years was going to be held in Lima, Peru later this year. It's been cancelled, it's been postponed, I should say, and we're hoping to hold it at a similar time next year. But really this slide was to welcome any of you who are younger to feel free to join the IAAH Young Professionals Network. which regardless of your interests, you would be very welcome. So check out the website, IWH.org. And I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and Kate, hand back to you.
Great, thank you. Super interesting, Susan. I think we're starting to see some questions from the chat box, and I do encourage you, as you're chewing on all this information that Susan has provided you with, please do input your questions into the chat box. But I'd like to start out, Susan, by asking you a couple of questions. One of the things I think we're all challenged with is, how do we take this really rich information and begin to apply these findings in the kind of programs that many of the folks that are on the webinar this morning are implementing? And then the second question would be, so what are some of the top 2 or 3 priority actions we should be striving towards to begin to bend the curve to sustain the gains that we make in early childhood, all the monies that we invest in children, and sustaining those gains through adolescence and into adulthood? So I'm going to throw those 2 questions out to you. They're big ones. And then we'll take questions from the chat box.
Sure. So, I think, that the challenge for adolescents is really hard, because I think that in so many countries, people are still relying on global developmental assistance, if you like, because at a national level, there is so little capacity within their public health departments, there is so little capacity within their education ministries, within their transportation ministries, to really have an appreciation of what adolescence is about. And a couple of years ago, George Patton and I developed a massive open online course, a MOOC, on global adolescent health that still runs about 3 or 4 times a year, that I would really commend, not necessarily to the folk who have done this, you're very welcome to it, but at a country level, I think that one of the challenges is that there is so little leadership capacity at a national level in adolescence and adolescent health. And I think until we have that, it's pretty hard, because clearly in many countries, we have this overwhelming burden of ill health in under 5-year-olds. Obviously, we've got this COVID pandemic, which is really critical. But I think that in this COVID time, my sense is that countries are suddenly starting to appreciate the importance of adolescent well-being, the importance of education for children and adolescents. So I think the lessons for implementation, if I take a step back, are to really think multi-sectorally, to go beyond health. So if we go back to my butterfly diagram of the life course and matching actions to need with those the wings of the butterfly, how do we really start to be investing not just in health problems, but in those social determinants of health, and particularly in the proximal social determinants of health. And for adolescents, that's education, that's family, that's changing gender roles, and that really is about programs that are supporting positive youth development, that are providing, I think for girls in particular, for programming, it's really helping, it's going back to V.S. Naipaul, those ideas we have of our possibilities. Positive youth development programs are incredibly powerful ways of supporting girls and boys, obviously, to have a very different sense of their own capabilities. But I think the balance of investing in positive youth development, of also investing in health promoting schools. So I've been doing some work with WHO at the moment, and WHO and UNESCO, and it's very much a multi-UN agency initiative, is now really starting to be ramping up this notion of health promoting schools, for schools not just as a site for health education, as we might have given it, as important as comprehensive sexuality education is, but in addition recognising that notion of schools as a community, and what happens within school environments is that way of helping young people think about the possibilities that they have of themselves. That's probably enough for starters? I'm seeing lots and lots of questions here. I've got no idea how we're going to get through any of them.
Yeah, so folks know, because we started a little bit late, we will extend ourselves to 8:15 our time, which is different times. We'll go an extra 15 minutes over the hour. If you are able to stay, we welcome you to stay on for the extra 15 minutes. And yes, we're getting some really good questions coming into the chat box. But I would love for you to say, before we go to some of the questions in the chat box, I'd love for you to say a little bit more about positive youth development. And of course, you and I had interacted a bit over the Youth Power Project, which was funded by USAID. And some of our colleagues here may be a little less familiar with the whole notion of positive youth development, or PYD. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, look, I think well, Kate, you probably can say just as much about positive youth development, or if not more than me. But, you know, I think typically we tend to think about programming in vertical silos. So, you know, for you guys in FP 2020, you know, this will be around sexual and reproductive health programming. Or, you know, you might have colleagues who are invested in HIV programming. And so, you know, this is where you tend to be thinking of the health system, and you tend to be addressing either health problems or, you know, trying to build health information or health literacy at best. But positive youth development programs, and this is where I think I should have had all of these other slides as well, you know, cut across all of those vertical silos, regardless of whether you're talking about trying to promote emotional well-being, trying to reduce mental disorder, try to improve sexual and reproductive health. It is about it's about helping equip young people with a set of skills. So there's no single right way of having a positive youth development program. It might be an arts-based program, it might be a sports-based program. They typically have adult leaders as part of the program and try and then empower youth leadership as part of that as well. But it's a way of providing safe spaces for adolescents and young adults in their communities. That might be, for example, homework clubs that are also helping young kids then move safely into their communities and provide them with access through to other ideas or other resources in their communities that might link them to, you know, arts programs or music programs or cultural pursuits. But they are typically trying to equip kids with a set of life skills and a set of beliefs and attitudes that are more, if you like, health promoting, more positive in their orientation. They're typically not disease focused, they're typically not in vertical silos. But Kate, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's a good definition. The only thing I might add is, you know, the way we often presented it at USAID is, you know, and I think this comes up in your Lancet paper as well, is so many of the factors that lead to poor sexual and reproductive health outcomes actually occur because of other factors like early marriage or being out of school. And so, you know, the need to look at some of those root causes and also begin to build those positive factors that mitigate risk and buffer against risk. So good parent-child relations.
Absolutely.
I remember from a project I worked on a number of years ago, one of the most important predictors of whether or not adolescents were going to be taking positive actions around their health was if they felt like they were valued members of their communities and they had opportunities to participate in their communities and they weren't sidelined, marginalized, you know, pushed away, told these things are not for you. So
it's interesting, in the Lancet Commission, you know, what we highlighted is the best investment to be made for adolescent health is quality education.
Exactly.
And, you know, the data is very, very clear that the more years of schooling that girls and boys enter into, the less likelihood there is, obviously, in terms of early pregnancy, of early marriage. And so this is incredibly important. Yep.
And unfortunately, those of us who work in the health sector, oftentimes our funds are tied to the health sector and we are unable to do much in the education sector. And oftentimes school health programs are very separate from the health programs that are implemented by the Ministry of Health. So coming back to this sort of investment question, Emily asked, given the fact that the investment in adolescents is so low when they make up such a large proportion of the populations in many of the countries where we work, do you see this potentially changing?
Look,
more money is invested in young people.
Yeah.
Advocates,
Look,
this is your call to action.
yeah. This will change when we have stronger advocacy. You know, that one of the challenges, and this is where George Patton and I have been, you know, saying again and again that adolescent health is everywhere and nowhere. You know, that it's part of everything, and yet within the UN community, there hasn't yet been sufficient leadership taken, and a single UN agency really framed as taking the responsibility for adolescent health. So I think that's something really important to be thinking about. But I do think that it is, as I said, I think it's building capacity in individual countries. And this is why I'm such a strong supporter of the International Association for Adolescent Health, which is trying to be supporting individual leaders in the individual countries sort of build their capacity and riff off the ideas from others to think about what they can be doing. You know, this is a 50-year agenda ahead of us. But I think the COVID-19 crisis is one where I think that communities perhaps are able to appreciate the innovation and the preparedness of young people to engage in innovations in a way that older populations aren't. And that young people are, you know, certainly in Australia, I'm seeing two different populations have visibility brought to them in COVID-19 that we've never seen to the same extent before. One is the elderly and the other is adolescents, but obviously completely different reasons.
And yet, I think what we're seeing in terms of the adolescent response to COVID-19 in many countries is they aren't being addressed. And in fact, a lot of the information that's going out to young people is more of kind of a scold.
Absolutely. So if we go back to the notion of the simulated driving experiment, then I think the learning from that is, how do we, and I'm going to use marketing and advertising speak here, how do we not give a single message to the community about stay at home or whatever the message might be, but how do we look at sub-segmenting the market? So how do we try and develop messages that are more influential and motivational for young people's behaviour than might be for older adults? I can hear a fair bit of echo.
I hear somebody needs to mute. Yeah, thank you.
But yes, so I mean, certainly in Australia, we have had no separate health promotional messaging or communication messaging to young people. And I think that we are desperately in need of that, because young people are feeling much more, you know, they're not feeling vulnerable like us older adults might be. And I think we need to think about the messaging.
So another question that's popped up from the chat box might be, it's a straightforward question, but I think it may be a little challenging to answer, is, you know, you put up earlier in the presentation that, you know, the different UN agencies have different definitions of children and adolescents. Andrew from Malawi is asking why that is so, and are we any closer to coming up with a more aligned definition of adolescence?
Look, I think we're much closer than we were before, so I'd actually like to give a very positive message about that. And if there's one thing that our Age of Adolescence paper did achieve in terms of calling for this age extension or an extended definition up to 24, was that I think it brought all of the agencies on board that were not up to 19 to appreciate that they needed to extend at least up to 19. So I think we are much more on the same page than we were before.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you're not speaking, can you please mute your line? There's a fair amount of echo and feedback. Thank you.
But just there's one thing I would add about that, which is that for the last 25 years of my academic life in Australia, virtually every committee that I've sat on, as I mentioned, I'm a paediatrician, so I deal with, you know, children's programs that typically extend upwards in the age course. But there's hardly a committee that I've sat on in the last 25 years in which I haven't said, and what about adolescence? Or why is this program stopping at 14? And so this is a role for all of us. It's a role that we can each play in terms of advocacy within every organisation in which we work in. How can we keep adolescents' needs front of mind? Because in our governments, in our communities, too often there are people whose expertise is in younger children or in older adults and far less expertise around adolescents. So I'd really charge you all for that, to do that.
And it's sort of in keeping with that observation. We have a question from, I'm not going to be able to say the name correctly, but, and I think this is something that the Lancet Commission called out as well, is how do we do a better job of involving adolescents in these kind of decision-making activities? And the comment being that most of our political leaders take things which suit the adults and which don't necessarily apply to adolescents. And so what are some things that we can do to make it easier or more supportive for young people to participate?
So I think the notion of, youth participation is very clear in terms of the importance of that, in terms of individual young people's learning of those young people who are actually participating in those leadership activities themselves. But I would turn it around to say that, I'm a professor of adolescent health, and in my own organisation, I can go on and on and on about something, but it seems pretty easy for my chief executive officer just to sort of pretend he hasn't heard it. Whereas if I take a group of young people along who are saying the same thing, because I listen to young people and so I often find myself repeating what they're saying, that it is much harder for our political leaders, our organisational leaders, to ignore the voices of young people. Young people can often say it much more powerfully, certainly, than people like me can. So I think engaging with young people. Now, young people don't have all of the solutions themselves, and I think sometimes perhaps we go overboard a bit by overly looking at the solutions that they might have, just like we can go, we've historically gone overboard in not listening, or underboard in terms of not listening to them at all. And I think it's a balance here. But I think finding ways of engaging young people and helping them to identify solutions that will be meaningful for them are far more likely to be motivational and influential about their own behaviours. But this is obviously where, one young person can't speak for different groups of young people. And, too often we know that it's much more likely to be young people who are more articulate, who have greater education, who are still in school, rather than the more socially marginalised LGBTQI kids, those who are disabled or in ethnic minority groups, for example, whose voices are often less able to be heard. But having any young people's voices there is an important starting point. And so thinking about how organisations build approaches to have, youth advisory committees and teams working with you that can be providing input into the programs that you're developing is a really valuable first start.
So we're at 8:01 US time, so we'll go for another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up. So please do stay with us. Here's another question from one of our team members. Is oftentimes we're given monies to focus on a very narrow aspect of adolescent health and development. And so what are some ways that program implementers could integrate this more of an adolescent development lens into their program design?
So I think there are two things. I mean, one is thinking about partnerships. So it's thinking about the partnerships in the communities in which you're working, so that your funding might be around a very specific something. And obviously your key performance indicators are going to be around that. So, you do need to do what you've been funded to do. But if you can partner with two different other groups, or even one different other group that's doing, that's also interested in adolescents, but perhaps has a stronger focus on positive youth development, for example, then your money can go much further and your linkages and intersectoral opportunities can be greatly leveraged and extended. So, this is where I think that it is on the ground within communities that you guys have a much more powerful opportunity to actually achieve the sort of leverage that is required. Obviously, in the longer term, it's also about educating your funders. And that's obviously not necessarily the role of the recipients at a country level, but perhaps rather, the role of groups like FP 2020 that really has the opportunity to try and do that. But I think it's about partnerships, it's about collaborations.
Yeah, I agree. Another question, some great questions here, and it's hard to sift through all of them, but the slide where you showed the yin yang, the empower versus care and protect, and what adolescents should be learning. And so maybe you could say a little bit more about how you think we can get that right balance between care and protect and empower patients while still respecting the diversity of adolescents.
Sure. And it's really hard, and there's no single right answer, I think, is the sort of the bottom line here. But let me give you an example in the paper, because this was where, and it was really interesting. When we published this paper, it was in the middle of January, and it was clearly a very slow news week. And I was about to hop on a plane to go from Australia to London for a meeting. And I had the BBC on the line as my stepson is driving me to the airport. And then, all hell broke loose after this fairly combative interview with this person on the BBC, who clearly, a sociologist who clearly hadn't read the paper. And I think was trying to suggest that, young people should be kept under cotton wool until they're 24. And it's like, you haven't read the paper. This is not what I'm saying. But because of that, this paper went completely viral. It was the best thing that happened. It really got huge coverage for the paper. But every media person who interviewed me started off being very negative and was sort of somehow, and they're all young, obviously, as journalists, but they were all sort of saying, what do you mean? Adolescents 24, And then, I would basically take them through what I meant. And so what I would always start by saying, what this means is that we need to be changing laws to bring the legal age of different things down, to be lowering the age of certain things in order that young people can participate more. And I gave the example in the paper of voting. So in Australia, we have mandatory voting. Everyone has to vote, and you enroll on the electoral roll when you're 18. And in Australia, it would make a lot of sense that our mandatory voting started at the age of 16. And even if it was just for local government or state elections at the age of 16, and perhaps then, federal elections at the age of 18. But if you were to lower the voting age, that's a way of gaining young people's understanding of civic participation, of helping them understand what democracy might be around, the importance of voting, getting them supported through their schools to actually sign up on the electoral roll. And in terms of intellectual capability, clearly there's every evidence that 16-year-olds are just as smart as 26-year-olds or 66-year-olds. And it would also be a meaningful way of getting governments to be more addressing policies to younger people as well. So that was an example of lowering the age for greater, if you like, participation and empowerment. On the other hand, the example we gave was in New Zealand. New Zealand has recently increased its age for young people in care, so who are under the care of the wards of the state, under the care of the state, and whose parents are no longer their guardians. And historically, these kids, the most vulnerable, some of the most vulnerable kids in the community, on the age of 18, the government would just wave goodbye, and they had no further engagement, no further supports provided by government. And yet, for any of you who are parents of 18-year-olds, know that most young people still need a fair bit of care and support into their, mid to late 20s in terms of that transition. So the New Zealand government appreciated this, and at a policy level, basically made it very elective. If young people didn't want anything more with the government, they didn't have to have anything more to do with the government. But they provided housing, access to low-cost housing that local government areas were mandated to provide. They provided access to ongoing social work and career guidance for another 3 years. And they also provided, I think, some relatively low-interest loans for young people as well outside of the banking system. So it was a transition period, if you like. And that's, we articulated as a way of helping to, that was still protecting and supporting young people, even though they had turned 18. And the other example we used that in Japan, that did have the age of being able to buy alcohol at the age of 21, And in Japan, historically, voting has only been from the age of 21. And so they were going to be reducing the voting age down to 18. And there was a fair bit of debate suggesting, well, they should be lowering the alcohol age as well, down from 21 to 18. And in this paper, we sort of said, no, you know, again, voting is a safe activity. We should be reducing the age of voting from 21 to 18. That's a good thing to be doing. But actually, there are harms associated with alcohol. So maintaining the age of alcohol where it's historically been in Japan at 21 would be perfectly sensible. So that's what, you don't have to align the ages. And in my own practice in Australia, for example, I'm very happy to provide confidentially consultations to young people about access to contraception, of whatever contraception they want. I'm very happy to provide that without parental consent, although I typically work fairly hard to try and encourage that if it seems as if it's appropriate. But if it was a young person who was seeking a termination of pregnancy where there are greater risks and the significance is greater, I would be working harder with that young person to be thinking about which adult they might share that with, not necessarily a parent if they don't feel able to do so. So again, even within the one person, if you like, the degree of risk, the significance of what the intervention might be, might make you decide whether you can do something at an earlier age or actually whether an older age is more appropriate. For me, this thinking in this way of balancing risk and empowerment, of protection and participation, has been transformative in the way I've thought about policy framing for adolescents. I've found it very helpful.
So we're going to take one last, and then so we'll throw you a doozy for your last question.
This is from you.
No, this is actually from the audience. And, you know, in many of the countries where we work, you know, religion and religious leaders play an incredibly important role in terms of young people's access to information, young people's access to services. And oftentimes they can be oppositional. And so what are some ways that we could perhaps do a better job of bringing the religious leaders and cultural leaders along with some of this thinking to get their support for investments in adolescent health?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I'm aware, for example, in Pakistan, that a couple of years ago, I think it was Rutgers, was the group that engaged with where they were trying to develop some comprehensive sexuality education in rural communities in Pakistan. I can't now remember what region it was. And they worked incredibly effectively to be engaging the religious leaders in that country within and groups of parents and school, you know, the parent-teacher association equivalents in school communities, so groups of parents as well as school communities, because this was school-based sexuality education that they were wanting to introduce. And they were really able to, over a protracted period of time, but they were really able to work with religious leaders so that actually the religious leaders were able to endorse this, were able to support this, that gave parents a lot of confidence that this was a reasonable thing to do. I've been doing some work myself with colleagues in Indonesia, again, a very conservative society where in rural Indonesia, in this part of the Indonesia where Islam is predominant. And parents in this study was very much looking at parenting attitudes to adolescents. And parents were, it was very clear, were turning to their imams, were turning to the mosques in terms of, were turning to religious schools in terms of seeking advice. And they were getting, I have to say, not particularly good advice. And therefore, you know, if you are wanting to change things in those communities, then finding ways of engaging with those religious leaders, and not just the religious leaders in the local communities who are often relatively conservative themselves in rural areas, but going to religious leaders who are the heads of those countries can often be much more powerful because they are often more liberal-minded in the ways that they might be thinking about things. But engaging parent associations, engaging religious groups, engaging governments, engaging school leaders and principals, and engaging young people themselves, I think is really important.
We had a really good conversation in our own office a couple of weeks ago about the difference between individualist and collectivist societies, where 88% of the world lives in collectivist societies, where the community norms, community practices, community beliefs really influence individual behaviors and practices. And so I think it's really important that we continue to think about how we work with parents, with teachers, with religious leaders, because those are the key gatekeepers. It's not enough to just provide information to young people and provide youth services, but they need those kind of supports. So we're almost at time. I just wanted to thank you, Susan, so much for being our guinea pig and kicking us off this morning. Great discussion. We didn't get to all the questions. We will try to get to some of those questions. And we really appreciate all of you taking the time to spend an hour or so with us. We have recorded the session and we'll be posting it to the website of Knowledge Success. And I think FP, you want to watch it again or share it with your colleagues. We do encourage you to share this with your colleagues. And again, thank you all for attending. Thanks to FP 2020 and Knowledge Success for making this, this session happen. Please do join us again in 2 weeks when we have some adolescent health experts from the World Health Organization who will give us a historical overview of adolescent sexual and reproductive health programs starting from the 1994 ICPD, and then discussing some of the future directions where WHO would like to see us go. Don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. I also just want to let you know that we've been partnering with Susan and the International Association of Adolescent Health to generate a statement on the importance of including young people in COVID responses, and we will be launching that statement shortly. So do keep an eye out for that. That is being endorsed by a number of healthcare associations, such as pediatricians, gynecologists, midwives who do a lot of work or see a lot of adolescent clients. So keep an eye out for that, and hopefully you can use that as an important advocacy tool. Again, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.